Good evening, everybody. It's so great to have you all here again. Welcome to our 7th program in this virtual series, America at a Crossroads. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Special welcome to those of you for whom this is your first time with us. It's great to have you with us tonight, too. These virtual programs are part of the Community Conversation Series, which we have presented over the past 2.5 years. In total, more than 20 programs of exceptional quality have been presented. Tonight's program with David Frum and Peter Beinart, moderated by Madeleine Brand, is no exception. Both Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., the co-founders of this series, share a deep concern for the threats to our Constitution and democracy, threats which shockingly grow more serious every day. And for Jews United for Democracy and Justice, we are also propelled by the lessons of the Torah and the values of the Jewish people, which rhythmically converge with American democratic values and ideals. While it has gotten a little lost in the other dramatic events of the past week, the cases of coronavirus in LA County continue to grow. This week, we had the highest number of newly reported cases since the virus was first detected. We remain grateful to those on the front lines of fighting this virus. And this threat seems to be growing with upward trends. So we're quite concerned about that. We wish a full recovery to those that are ill, and we mourn with those who have lost loved ones. And as to the protest sparked by the murder of George Floyd, we join those who are ready to do the work to progress towards greater racial justice and equality. In addition to our program next week with Mayor Garcetti, which will delve into these issues, we are planning several additional programs on this critical topic, which we will announce in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, please remember to register for the Mayor Garcetti program, which is at 6 p.m., not our usual 5 p.m. next week, next Wednesday. You know the drill. You're going to get an email right after this program, and if you haven't registered yet, please do so via the Eventbrite registration link. An exciting addition to our series that we just confirmed today is that on July 15th, Pulitzer Prize winning conservative journalist and commentator George F. Will be our guest. His topic will be, will the Republican Party recover? Thank you to our donors who make these programs possible. And once again, anybody who would like to donate, just email me, respond to any of the emails you get from us, and I will instruct you how to do that. Thank you to our co-sponsors, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Israel of Hollywood, ECAR, Leo Beck Temple, Stephen Wise Temple, Jewish Center for Justice, and The Forward. Thank you very much for being part of this important series. By the way, you will each be getting a 1-month free trial subscription to The Forward, so keep your eyes peeled for that email to come. Thank you to the leadership of Judge Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, and David Lehrer. And speaking of David, he is not only on the leadership of Judge, but he has founded and leads Community Advocates, Inc., Judge's partner, and he's a terrific person and a great partner in these programs. I'm going to now turn the program over to David.
Thank you, Janice. On behalf of Community Advocates, I'm pleased to join Janet in welcoming you once again to America at a Crossroads virtual town hall. Our Wednesday evening encounters' popularity have exceeded our expectation by leaps and bounds. Clearly, people are concerned, and with good reason. The last 2 weeks have made transparent that there are millions across this country who are troubled by what is transpiring and are committed to change. And with over 1,300 people registered for tonight's program, you confirmed that fact. Tonight, we continue with our run of extraordinary speakers. We'll be hearing about what recent headlines mean from two very special political mavens, Peter Beinart and David Frum. In future weeks, we will host two of the nation's top legal scholars, as well as the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. I'm also pleased to announce that on July 8th, we'll have a panel of political pros handicapped the November election. USC's Bob Frum and Mike Murphy, and UCLA's Professor Lynn Vavrick. They'll cut through all the noise to tell us their take on what will be going on between now and November 3rd. A reminder, you'll be able to pose questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We will try our best to get to as many as possible. Our moderator this evening is our good friend Madeleine Brand, the host of the award-winning daily news and culture show Press Play on KCRW. She covers local, international, and cultural news through a Southern California lens. She's also the co-host of KCRW's legal podcast, The Legal Eagle Files. She's hosted and reported for NPR and its affiliate stations for more than 30 years. She's also a delight to work with. Madeleine?
Thank you so much, David. And I'm really honored to be part of this again. And I'm very happy to be with you. I've worked with you for many, many years, so it's really a delight. So thank you so much. Today's topic is two views of a controversial presidency. These two views definitely not on the positive side. And here's a clue. The title of David Frum's brand new book is Trumpocalypse: Restoring American Democracy. David is also a staff writer at The Atlantic. In another era, back in 2001, 2002, he was a speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush. Peter Beinart, also a writer for The Atlantic. He contributes to the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and Time Magazine. He's written 3 books and was the editor of the New Republic for many years. Peter and David will give a few remarks before we begin our discussion. And I will talk for a bit, then we'll get your questions. David Lehrer will cull through them, and I will ask them. And we're just gonna have a fantastic, enlightening, exciting next hour or so. So fasten your seatbelts. Let's begin with David. David?
Thank you. I remember on the night of the 2016 election, I was doing a television program. One of the strangenesses of television, of course, is that you're locked into a room while the whole, supposedly commenting on affairs, but in fact, no one is more isolated than you from what is actually going on in the world. But as it became clear that what was about to unfold, I telephoned home. My wife had gone to sleep. My older children were away, but I got my youngest daughter on the phone, and we just had this explosively emotional conversation about how I felt that my generation had very much failed hers. And I think we have all been wrestling with emotions like that through the past few years. Everything has come to a head in such a dramatic way in these past months. A terrible pandemic, a global depression, and now these civil disturbances and protests across cities in the United States. I think it is a testament to you that you are here tonight, because it is such a human impulse in a moment like this to close the blinds and say, I don't need to hear more bad news. I have my own private concerns, my own private worries, my own private joys. I don't need to be connected to this, to all these troubles and disturbances. But here you are, and I thank you and I commend you. And in a way, that may be the beginning of the change. I want to start tonight in a place where I've written now 2 books about the Trump presidency, and I've begun them with alarm and ended them on a tone of hope. I want to do it tonight the other way around. I want to open on a note of hope, and then give some reasons for explaining why I think this hope is important. I won't take an enormous amount of time because I know we are planning an interactive evening. But here's the hope. It's the nature of human life that human life is built on many small cruelties, many small injustices. The big ones excite us, but the small ones, it's easy to dismiss them as just part of the normal routine of human existence. And especially if you're on the easy side of them. If you're a man, it's easy to dismiss the concern of women. If you're white, it's easy to dismiss the concerns of blacks. If you're economically comfortable, to dismiss the concerns of the worried. Not the big concerns, not the things that might destabilize the society, but the small brutalities and cruelties. The kinds of things that have been talked about, especially by the Me Too movement. What the Trump presidency did was it took all of those small cruelties and it put them on a jumbotron in Times Square. Is it okay to use that analogy with a Los Angeles audience? It put them on a jumbotron in Times Square and multiplied them by 1 million. So everybody could see them. The President of the United States doing them, being dismissive, being cruel, being hurtful, aside from his many much more grave wrongdoings, much more his violations of law and Constitution, these things he put on display for the whole world to see. And a lot of people who in another time might have been of the kind to let him go and say, that's just, people make these kinds of comments, had to reckon with them when the President of the United States spoke them in such a public way. And people were challenged to think, how do I feel about all of this? I can't avoid it. I have to contend with it because there it is so big. Do I like it? How do I feel about it? And they realized, I do not like it at all. And so what we have seen through the Trump era is a kind of one of those moments. They occur at 30 and 40-year intervals of the awakening of America's conscience. We have seen this at intervals in the 1840s and at other times in American history, the Progressive Era, where people come together in a new way, outside often the political system, certainly outside the party system, to say, I want something different. This second wave of Black Lives Matter began in 2014, of course, but the second wave is a similar kind of movement, along with the Me Too movement. And I've written most of a new book about a prediction that the 2020s are going to be an era of both moral reform outside the party system and practical reform inside the party system. And that may be Donald Trump's most enduring gift to all of us. Why does this matter so much? We are moving into a world unlike anything that any living American has ever seen. The United States became the world's largest economy sometime in the 1890s. And through the past 130 years, the United States has been, at first with some competition and later effortlessly, the world's biggest, strongest, richest, most technologically advanced country, and the center of a network of alliances of countries that were similarly minded. For the first time since the 19th century, we are going to live, beginning sometime in the next 5 years, maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe a little more than that, who knows, in a world in which there are two great peer powers, the United States and China. The Chinese economy, as big, Chinese people not as rich individually, but as rich collectively, as technologically advanced as Americans. And under an authoritarian state that is trying to put its impress on the world in a way that is less ethical, less humane, less liberal, less committed to free trade, less committed to collective security than Americans. And the United States is going to need, as never before in its history, certainly in the history of those of us alive, to assemble a global coalition of like-minded democracies, market-minded democracies, to balance the power of China. Without the kind of easy supremacy, without the kind of hegemony that we could count on at moments in the past. If the United States is to lead, it has to inspire, because it's just not going to be the kind of effortless superpower that it was. When I served in the Bush administration, now almost 20 years ago, by most reckonings, the American economy was about 3 times the size of the Chinese economy. Today, neck and neck. We have spent 4 years under President Trump competing with China in all the wrong ways. President Trump in the last year spent $100 billion more on defense than President Obama did in his last year. And he spent much of that money preparing for a naval war with China. Well, we are now all communicating on Zoom instead of in person because of a failure of the Chinese state, because of a failure of the Chinese system that has impacted all of us. And no amount of warships could have protected us from them. And we are doing this, the countries of the Western democratic world, one by one, with no American leadership, each on its own. You've never seen President Trump or the American president, the American presidency standing shoulder to shoulder, Zoom image to Zoom image with partners from allied countries. Each country has been on its own, and we are all failing separately, each in our own ways, the British in one way, Americans in another way, Japanese, Singapore, Swedes, we're all failing each in our own way. But we should, instead of succeeding together as we can and must. In order to succeed together, we're going to have a political change at home so that America can lead in the world. I think one of the things that Peter and I, we've known each other for a long, long time, have in common, and we disagree about much, but is a sense that a world without American leadership is not a world that is safe for anything we care about. And one of the things I look forward to in the post-Trump era is finding a way to reestablish that American leadership, because that has been so dismally squandered. Amidst all the crimes, scandals, abuses, and outrages, I'm sure we'll be talking about many of them tonight, the stealing, the grift, the brutality, the bigotry, the incompetence, the corruption, amid all of that, I think those things at home, many of them we can fix. But our standing in the world will not soon forget that we did this. Last thought before I hand the mic to Peter. In the transition period, just after I'd had that very emotional conversation with my daughter, I went to visit the Reagan Library in the Simi Valley. And if you've been there, you know the road sort of winds to this hilltop where there's this very impressive library and where Ronald and Nancy Reagan are buried together. And along the road, there flutter banners with images of all the past presidents, from George Washington through the guys with beards from the late 19th century to the ones we all remember. And at that time, they don't post the picture of the current president. So at that time, there was no picture of Barack Obama. The last picture was George W. Bush. But in a month or two, when Barack Obama's term ended, his image would be there. And it just reminded me, and sometime after that, Donald Trump's image will be in that sequence. We can never efface that, and we shouldn't. It's part of the national story. It's part of who we are. It's a reproach, but it also can be maybe an inspiration.
Fantastic. David, I was thinking that too when he was elected, that history books will always have Donald Trump in them, and our children will be memorizing his name when they have to memorize all the American presidents. So that is something. Peter.
Thank you. I want to start by saying something to David and about David, because the Trump era has tested all of us, but it has tested people like David who are Republicans more. For people like myself who are on the left, it was overdetermined and obvious that we would revile Donald Trump for the beginning. I didn't have a lot of friends who were big Donald Trump supporters. I incurred no professional cost for saying what I thought about Donald Trump. It's different for people like David. And I have to say, I have watched, as many of us has watched, as people's true characters have come through in this era. And it's not always been a pretty sight. And one of the things that I've thought many, many times during this period is how important it will be for us to remember who showed moral courage and decency during this period and who did not. Who did not includes, from my mind, every Republican member of the Senate, save one, Mitt Romney, and an awful lot of political columnists and pundits. But David has been, I think, a real exemplar of moral courage. And I don't know all of the costs that it's taken on you, David, in terms of friendship, but I imagine that they're significant. I just want to say, I will always remember that. I think it's fitting that we're having this conversation during Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, since it is the most disconcerting and depressing book of the Torah, the book in which Moses asks to be killed, the book in which he has a falling out with his brother and sister, the book in which he takes the act, the striking of the rock, that leads to his death and his not being able to go into the land of Israel, the episode in which Jews are forced to wander for another 39 years, because I think that's the moment if we feel like we're in today, very much in the wilderness. And I think to try to understand why we're in this place, it's important to remember that as a multiracial democracy, the United States is a young democracy. It's been a democracy for some people for a long time, but as a democracy where most African Americans could vote, it goes back to the mid-1960s. That's less than 50 years. That makes us about as old as a democracy in a certain kind of way as Brazil, many other countries in the developing world. And the United States was founded on twin competing principles, one of which was democracy, another of which was the supremacy of whites and men and Christians. And I think what we have seen is that as the percentage of the country that is composed of people of color has grown, and as people of color and women to some degree have managed, in part because of the fact that African Americans were given the right to vote in the 1960s, have begun to amass some degree of political power, as represented by Barack Obama, as represented by Hillary Clinton, that the democratic process, that the Republican Party has had to move to ever more nakedly anti-democratic strategies because the democratic veneer is no longer possible if your commitment is to maintain white male Christian supremacy, which I think is in the Trump era, the dominant commitment of the Republican Party. And so we now have a presidential campaign in which Donald Trump has said very kind of blatantly that voter suppression will be the Republican tactic in 2016. if to try to make it as hard as possible for vote, perhaps to kind of create dysfunction and bureaucratic chaos, which has been helped by the coronavirus, so that we have an election on a national scale like what we've seen just in the last day or so in Georgia. It's a terrifying prospect. And since 2016, Ann Coulter was, I think, a very important figure in this move. The basic thrust of much Republican discourse has essentially been to delegitimize certain portions of the American population as people who essentially should not be considered legitimate members of the political system. Surprisingly, those tend to be, in particular, people of color. We face the prospect. I don't think anybody who looks at this clearly can say that there's not a real risk that Donald Trump, if he loses this fall in November, does not go quietly. I think, one of the most important stories for journalists these days is, I think, to keep a very, very, very close eye on what's happening in the U.S. military. We've already seen some very, very important moves in that regard in response to Donald Trump's efforts to send in the U.S. military against protesters, because it would not surprise me at all if ultimately people in the United States military have to make decisions about what happens after this fall's election, given that Donald Trump will grasp onto probably anything he can to try to delegitimize an election in which he loses. But if Donald Trump wins, it will most likely have been the third Republican out of the last 4 Republican victorious elections in which the person lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College. So that will also be a deeply delegitimizing process. I think one of the reasons that we have this mass explosion on the streets, obviously a lot of it is about police violence and George Floyd, but I think it's deeper. I think it's born of a sense by young people and people of color and progressives that the system has been progressively rigged against them, that they represent the majority will in the United States increasingly, and yet the political system has become increasingly warped to disenfranchise them. And another Trump victory and more Trump Supreme Court justices, I think, would inflame that and radicalize people on the left all the more. If the Democrats win, I think what we'll likely see is efforts to make it impossible for these anti-majoritarian efforts by the Republican Party to continue, efforts to make it much easier to vote, perhaps an effort to get rid of the filibuster, and potentially a very significant confrontation with the Supreme Court, which has a conservative majority right now. And as in the 1930s, you might see a kind of conservative Supreme Court facing off against a progressive Congress and president in an environment where Donald Trump has broken the guardrails in many, many ways in American politics. Joe Biden is not Donald Trump. He's not a kind of vicious man with demagogic authoritarian instincts, but people in power want to wield power. They want to get the things done that they want to get done. And it will be extremely tempting for the Democrats, now that Donald Trump has blown through a lot of guardrails, to start to blow through some guardrails of their own. Some of those may actually be legitimate in the sense that they will be efforts to make our system more democratic, but they will likely, I think, increase even more the sense among many conservatives and Republicans that they are a kind of an endangered species politically and demographically, which I worry will lead to increased radicalization. What I think the country desperately, desperately needs, and what David has been thinking about, to his credit, I know, is a Republican Party, a conservative party that actually competes for the votes of people of color rather than trying to disenfranchise and delegitimize people of color. A conservative party that embraces an increasingly non-white America and looks for ways to harmonize that with conservative principles. Donald Trump has done exactly the opposite. I mean, look at the Republican Party's relationship with Asian Americans. There would have been perhaps no non-white group where Republicans would have historically done so well and have had as many good arguments. The affirmative action argument was one that was kind of laying there for Republicans to take, given the opposition among many Asians to affirmative action. What does Donald Trump do instead? He he moves forward with this kind of nakedly racist discourse about the China Wuhan virus, which has actually led to kind of massive increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. We definitely desperately need Republicans to embrace this new America and compete within it. But I have to say, aside from Mitt Romney, I don't see that many figures in the Republican Party right now who are stepping forward to do that. What I see in people like Tom Cotton and Nikki Haley and others, frankly, is a kind of a more sophisticated Trumpism. I think that's going to lead to a political system in which we continue to have many, many crises to come. So I'll stop there.
Okay, wow. Lots of incredible ideas from both of you to try to pick up on. I want to pick up on that last point about Republicans, David, and put you on the spot. A Gallup poll came out today that showed Donald Trump's support down to 85% among the GOP. 85% sounds like a lot, but it is the lowest, I believe, the lowest of his presidency. Is that to you, does that tell you that there is some kind of tipping point with the Republican electorate that could then go to sway Republican senators, aside from Murkowski and aside from Romney, to break with Trump?
If you join the British Conservative Party, you fill out a form, you pay a small fee, they send you a card. They have your name, they have your address. They send you a lot of email asking for more money, of course. But they know who you are. There is a list. There is a list somewhere of members of the British Conservative Party. There's a list of members of the Labour Party. There's no such list in the United States. An American Republican is somebody who, when a pollster calls and says, do you belong to a Democrat? Are you a Democrat, Independent, Republican? Which are you? That's who they are. The number of people who are registered Republicans is that's one data point, but that subjective identity, that's the real number. That's what they're polling. People who tell the pollster, I'm a Republican instead of an Independent or a Democrat. Fractions are our friend here. Back in the Reagan years, in the middle 1980s, something of about a third of the country identified as Republican. About 40% at that time identified as Democratic. Since then, identification with both parties has dropped, and Republicans are now somewhere north of 20%. Democrats also have declined almost as steeply, not quite. So when Ronald Reagan would get 80% of 30%, that was actually a bigger number than, or 33 or 34%, than Donald Trump's whatever he claimed, 99 and 3/4, 102% of 22%. So bear in mind that this is a moving target. One of the things that was often said during the first 2 years of the Trump presidency to people like me, by, as Peter said, some of our former colleagues, some of our former friends, is that Never Trump Republicanism is not a political party, it's a dinner party. So I dedicated my new book to the conservatives and libertarians and Republicans of Never Trump, and quoted an old Methodist hymn, when all were false, I found thee true. Because they have mattered. They have been the most important faction of the Trump years. What happened in 2018? Why did the Democrats win their biggest victory in Congress since the Watergate election? Not because they won more seats in the Bay Area or the mouth of the Hudson. There were no more seats in the Bay Area, the mouth of the Hudson. They won them all already. The Democrats won by picking up Republican leading seats. You know, in California, that half the Republican seats in California were lost in the election of 2018. And these were in prosperous areas. I go through the roster. The seat that George H.W. Bush held in Texas, and he won it in 1966 in the most affluent area of Houston, River Oaks. That seat remained Republican through Watergate, through the Iraq War, through the global financial crisis. It went Democrat in 2018. Newt Gingrich's former district in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, it went Democrat in 1918, as indeed it almost, I think literally every seat in suburban Atlanta. Eric Cantor, who was the number 2 Republican in the House of Representatives under Barack Obama, the most senior Jewish member of the House, his seat went went Democratic in 2018, as did what may be the most affluent seat in the country on the south bank of the Potomac River, around the CIA and the affluent suburbs of Washington. That seat has been Republican for 60 of the past 66 years. And by the way, in all those cases, the winner was a woman. So what we have seen is a political change driven by moderate to conservative, Republican open or Republican identified, or certainly Republican leaning, especially women, suburbanites, who want to see, who are not signed up for some big new agenda. That's why they preferred Biden over anyone else in the primaries, but who want to see a more stable and normal American government. And that's going to be a very important shaping fact. It's going to be a traumatic fact for many Democrats who find themselves winning, I expect, a pretty big victory in 2020, but with a much more divided party and with many more brakes on the ambition of the more progressive elements, because they have carried with them so many people from what would normally be Republican districts.
So given what's happening right now, and politics are changing so quickly, it does feel like we are in a transformative moment politically, and especially for Democrats. There is a movement to the left and a strenuousness of that move to the left since the killing of George Floyd. So Peter, I'm wondering, is this something that is sustainable for the left, for Democrats? Will there be a large shift in American public opinion towards the left that we're seeing right now, or will it go back to kind of where it was? Is there in fact a huge shift, or are we just seeing a very temporary, passionate moment?
If you look at younger people, they are to the left of older people on almost everything. Now that's partly because the younger generation is more diverse, right? Higher percentage of millennials and Gen Z are people of color. But even among white millennials and Gen Z, they are further to the left on both economic and cultural issues. So while I think David is certainly correct that the Biden administration is going to have a challenging time maneuvering between the activist protesters who want a really ambitious agenda and a lot of Democratic moderates. And let's remember, I mean, Bill Clinton had enormous trouble with the kind of blue dog Democrats. There were actually more of them back then, kind of more conservative Democrats like John Breaux from Louisiana, David Barnes from Oklahoma, for instance. Barack Obama had a lot of trouble with people like Ben Nelson from Nebraska. So that's not entirely a new story, but while the Democratic Party will certainly be divided and it will be challenging, I do think that we are seeing generationally a pretty significant ideological shift. I mean, I think not, if you look at what's just happened over the past few weeks, at the beginning of these protests, when there was some rioting, there was a lot of people just to kind of assume there would be a big backlash because their template was formed in the late 1960s. Back when Colin Kaepernick, was taking a knee and Black Lives Matter emerged with its kind of more militant rhetoric. Again, a lot of people said this is not the way to do it. You're going to alienate the country. We're actually seeing that to a remarkable degree, that public opinion is shifting towards, and it's partly because crime has been low for a long time, shifting in the direction of some, I think, fairly substantial rethinking of American policing, which I think is a good thing, just as it shifted away from mass incarceration, which is a good thing. And the other critical thing to understand about younger people and the reason they are pushing the Democratic Party to the left, and I would say even younger Republicans are further to the left than older Republicans, is because economically, people who have come of age in the wake of the Great Recession and now in the wake of coronavirus, in a country where people come out of college with ever greater amounts of debt, where our minimal welfare state is geared towards the old, not the young, have not been able to find their feet economically in the way previous generations have. And it is that tremendous economic difficulty that has produced a lot of the radicalization that we're seeing. And I don't see anything structurally on the horizon anytime soon that is going to change that. So I think the Democratic Party is going to move left. And yes, there are going to be a lot of internal problems. There will be times when they overreach, but I think it's also quite possible that they are able to shift the center of gravity, the 50-yard line of American politics, just like Ronald Reagan did when he won in 1981.
So you're talking about a seismic shift in American politics. You're talking about a revolution in thought that we rarely see.
I mean, just look at the debate about policing and criminal justice. The Democratic Party is moving full scale towards putting new kind of curbs of power on the police, and talking about just redistributing some police funding away towards community service programs. And that's the more remarkable thing is the Republican members of Congress are not clear that they want to stand in the way of this. Right, Donald Trump does, but if you look at Republicans in Congress, they are deeply ambivalent about whether they want to oppose that. And that's because the polling, he is moved in a way that is really, really different than within it. Whereas, again, nothing is permanent. There of course will be backlashes, but I do think that it's possible we are moving into an age in which the parameters of what's thinkable in terms of progressive politics are simply more ambitious than they were under Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, in part because we have an activist, a kind of now years and years of kind of leftist grassroots activism that simply did not exist in the 1990s or the first decade of the 20th century in the same way.
David, a lot of focus in the last election on the white working class. Where do the currents leave them? And as Peter has identified, huge economic suffering amongst the working class, white, people of color, everybody, and on up the economic ladder for that matter after coronavirus. But to what extent do people vote based on that versus on something more inchoate, something more about values, patriotism, making America great again, all of that, even if that isn't in their best economic interests?
Well, I think, look, voter ignorance is a very real thing. I'm told by pollsters that at any given moment, half the country cannot name the Vice President of the United States. But there is one thing that every human being is the world's leading expert on, and it is, how am I, this particular human being, doing? They know a lot about that. And I would just ask everyone watching this call, when you think about how to vote, do you reward most the candidate who promises to put the most money in your personal pocket? Or are you a compilation of values and interests that balances those things and that is willing to pay some economic price for your values, and that is willing also to pay at some point, some values price for your economic interests? We're all complicated in that way. And we also don't necessarily separate clearly always our values from our economic interests. Those things kind of blur. Donald Trump, we paid so much attention to that white, when we say working class, we also mean the post-industrial working class, because of Donald Trump's very unusual electoral map in 2016, where he had this breakthrough into the industrial Midwest or the post-industrial Midwest, and did especially well among people with kind of a Catholic cultural identification, but who are not actively involved in religion. We're going to have a very different map in 2020. The battlegrounds are going to be states like North Carolina. They may possibly be a particularly bloody battleground in Georgia. I mean, Donald Trump is just a dead duck in Michigan. It's not going to be a swing state. I think things are going to be a little bit better for him, and maybe in Pennsylvania, maybe in Wisconsin, but those two states, minus Michigan, he's going to have to pick up some ground somewhere. And meanwhile, he's in trouble in a lot of places where there are knowledge economies. What I want to pick up on, though, something Peter said about this coming age of, I have suggested that we're going to see an age of activism outside the political system, and even outside the party system, and even outside the political system. The Federal Reserve today predicted that we are going to have pretty disappointing job growth into 2022. And the Biden presidency, which, should it be, and I expect it will be, is going to find itself contending with slow economic growth. It's going to find itself contending with shrinking world trade or stagnant world trade. It's going to find itself also possibly facing some climactic shocks. I think one of the real lessons of coronavirus is things that people on the McNeil era, or the Lehrer, or whatever they call it now, the News Hour, I'm showing my age, say this might be a big problem someday, and that you can ignore while people saying it might be a big problem someday. Those things have a way of becoming all at once a very big problem all at once. And just as the coronavirus showed us that pandemic shocks, we had warnings of them with the bird flus in the 2000s, the swine flu in 2009, and then suddenly this, or seemingly suddenly this. Climate will burst upon us in the same way, and it will probably begin to burst upon us in that same way fairly soon. I wonder how much of the politics of the 2020s is going to look like the progressive activism of now. I mean, if I were a progressive activist, which I'm certainly not, and I had one wish, it would be that Twitter could somehow be uninvented. Because Twitter, there's a real risk that Twitter becomes the Fox News of the left, a place where people go for comfort and assurance and mutual radicalization, but also to hide from an outside world that isn't as hospitable to them as this safe space makes it feel that the outside world is. We're going to have a pretty tough economy in the 2020s, and we are going to have a lot of disappointment, and we're going to have some real constraints on the Biden administration's ability to act. And we're going to have tremendous both economic and financial troubles. That it is so abnormal to have interest rates nearly zero. We've had them nearly zero since 2009. We've had them nearly zero through the recovery beginning in 2010. And every time the Federal Reserve tries to raise them to something more like an historic level, the stock market freaks out. Why are low interest rates so dangerous? Because they create the illusion that capital is free and that you can do anything, and that people who are in charge of investments don't have to make intelligent choices about what to do and what not to do. And the very low interest rates are also an artifact of the world's hot money flowing into the United States, not because Americans offer necessarily the best place to put it, but because we're offering political stability. And so we are getting an economic and financial bonus from our political success, not from our economic and financial success, which have been in many ways disappointing. The 2020s are going to be, Donald Trump inherited an easy time. He was dealt the easiest hand of any president probably in living memory. And the next president is going to be dealt a hard hand, and it's going to be, so is Barack Obama in 2009, but this hard hand is going to be a very hard hand to play as well as to receive.
Okay, I'm going to start reading the questions because we have so many questions, many great questions. An incredible number of questions concerned about the failure of Republican elected officials to separate themselves from Trump. So, Peter, is this the moment where they grow a spine and do that?
I don't think you're seeing any growing of spine. I do think what is interesting, will be interesting to watch, is at what moment do Republican senators become so convinced that Donald Trump is going to lose that they then feel it's safe and even politically advantageous to start to distance themselves from him. That's going to be a really interesting thing to watch as people start to kind of position themselves for the post-Trump era, if they believe that's what's happening. You know, to me, the thing that depresses me, I mean, the most in a way, is that some of the Republicans who have just decided basically to kind of wait out the Trump presidency, basically keep their heads down, not pick any fights with Donald Trump, go along with everything he does, not answer questions about him, and basically just try to wait until he's over so they can go back to normal. I'm thinking of Marco Rubio. I'm thinking of Ted Cruz. Many Republicans, I think, fall into this category. Tom Cotton, a little bit, though. Cotton has actually embraced Trumpism a little more. I think it's extremely important that not be allowed to happen. That people be held to account for what happened. I do think the Republican Party, I think it's interesting that David mentioned China, because if I had to guess, I would guess that the Republican Party will reconstitute itself around China, around the idea of a new Cold War. I think Republicans are, especially because of the Reagan template, very comfortable and with the notion of a Cold War, and it combined them, the people who supposedly came clear about human rights, the people who are now taking a protectionist economic line, and the people who want kind of geopolitical confrontation and more military spending. I think that people may look to kind of reconstitute around those things, but I think it's very, very, very important that we make people answer for how they spent these last 4 years.
But you mentioned China. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can I jump in there? Because the action in the Republican Party is going to be at the state level. And the great trauma of American politics in 2021 is going to be what happens in state legislatures. The origin of what happened to the Republican Party was they had this catastrophic success in 2010. They won extraordinary numbers of state races and achieved the biggest the strongest dominance at the state level that any American political party has had since the Republicans had it in the 1920s. And by coincidence, those big years can come at any time. The Democrats had one in 2006, but the Republicans had their big year in a census year. There was not only a big Republican win in 2010, there was also a census in 2010 and an opportunity then to redistrict in 2011. To that point, your ability to gerrymander in American politics had been constrained by two things. First, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said you had to protect some number of seats for minorities in approximately at least in the states that had had Jim Crow before 65. And second, by a kind of balance of terror. If you were redistricting in 1990 and you were a Republican and you happened to have command of Florida, you had to worry, well, the Democrats will do to us as we do to them. So we have to be careful because they control seats. The Republicans had controlled so many states that they couldn't be deterred. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a case that actually was not quite crazy, but had some unfortunate effects, the Supreme Court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act. And so the Republicans remade states. Well, 2020 is also likely to be a wave election and also in a census year. And Democrats are going to have an opportunity in 2021 to do unto the Republicans, perhaps as much as the Republicans did unto them in 2011. And so a lot of the energy and passion and paranoia and vitriol of American politics are going to be seen at the state level in places. I've mentioned North Carolina before. In Wisconsin, right now, in 2018, Republicans won, I think, if I remember right, 45% of the vote. Of all votes cast in Wisconsin state elections. There are 99 seats, if I remember this right, in both houses of the Wisconsin legislature. 45% of the vote translated into 64 of the 99 seats. Democrats.
Oh, I think we're losing David there. Peter,
Yeah.
Can you pick up where he took up? I mean,
yeah.
Especially when you talk about Georgia and what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
We can see the beginnings of the strategy to challenge voting. I'm sorry, we moved on.
Fair enough.
So we're talking about Georgia and mail-in voting. So there's a lot of challenges to mail-in voting. Georgia, you saw these incredibly long 4-hour lines, mainly for Black people to vote, and the shortage of voting machines. And when they got to vote, these voting machines broke down. So is that what we're going to be seeing a lot more of in November?
I'm afraid so. I mean, I think you've got the combination of, look, the Republican National Committee has said they're spending millions and millions of dollars to fight efforts to basically to send out ballots to people by mail. They've opposed the Democrats' effort to send the states sufficient amounts of money so they could prepare for elections where you have more voting, by mail. So I think that it's, to me, it's a strategy of voter repression and also a strategy to some degree of kind of welcoming chaos in the hopes that that'll mean fewer people are voting and maybe muddy results in various ways. If Democrats do win, and they especially if they win the Senate, I do think Democrats will move to pass a legislation which changes the way that changes these things in pretty fundamental ways, automatic voter registration, a whole series of things that basically kind of try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But I really shudder to think about the potential chaos that we could have in this November's election, and to think about what would happen if we kind of had any kind of rerun of 2000. We're still living with the consequences. Again, if you want to understand why younger Democrats, younger progressives are more radical, less willing to ever give conservatives the benefit of the doubt on anything. It has to do partly with these set of experiences, and I really worry about America going through something like that again.
So what happens with these young voters, who many of whom were interested? there's one. Yeah. Many of whom were interested in Bernie Sanders and not interested at all in Joe Biden. Do they vote in November, or do they sit it out?
Is this for me or for David?
For you, because you were talking about
look, I don't think that Joe Biden is gonna inspire a massive turnout among young voters, or for that matter, among African American voters. The good news for him is that he's doing so well among older white voters that he doesn't need to at this point. I mean, something could change, right? But he's doing, because whether it's coronavirus and Donald Trump's mismanagement of that or whatever, the Republican Party's kind of lock on older white voters has diminished to some significant degree. And that, I think, means that he has a kind of cushion. He doesn't need to have the epic turnout among core-based voters that Hillary Clinton needed.
David, so what does this mean for Biden and where he needs to go politically to secure the younger voters? Does he need to pick someone like a Stacey Abrams to be his vice presidential running mate?
Many people have compared this election to 1968, and I've written about why I think that comparison is wrong. The election, I think that if you're looking for comparisons, is our exact cognate election of 1920. That was an election after the Great Flu, the worst pandemic since the Black Death. That was a year of racial strife. In that case, it was race riots in which returning white soldiers from the war often targeted Black workers who had taken jobs in northern factories. It was a year of terrible inflation and then a severe economic downturn. And in that year, the out party, the Republicans, nominated Warren Harding, who was just a giant nothing, a giant nobody. There was nothing inspiring, nothing appealing about Warren Harding, and he beat the the candidate of the end party by the largest margin in the history of American elections. He didn't have to do much. He just had to not be the people who were in charge of this mess. And I don't think that. I think that there's this Democrats. I mean, Democrats are sort of people believe in active politics, and they're always agitated, and they've lived through the trauma of 2016. They think things are going to. The fact that Biden is in a basement, I don't think that may be the ideal, optimal strategy. Maybe that's in fact exactly, because every day he's not in the basement, there's a risk Biden may make news, and that news might be good, but it could be bad. Every day that Biden is in the basement, Donald Trump is making news, and it's like a 99.75% chance that news will be bad for Donald Trump. So I don't think there's a lot of strategizing that Democrats need to do. And as for the vice presidential choice, I wish Biden health and I wish him long life, but he is the oldest candidate, the Democrat, that anyone has ever nominated to the presidency of the United States, and we are living through a global pandemic. So my advice to him would be pick someone who can do the job of president, especially the national security component of that job, instantly. And don't worry about this group or that group. If you've promised to pick a woman, okay, you made your promise. But think about the presidency, don't think about the electorate.
So is that person Kamala Harris?
Look, I'm not in the business of giving Democrats advice, but I think there are a lot of, I would think not necessarily has to be someone who holds elected office. I would look for, if I were Biden, someone, because he promised a woman, but someone with really robust governmental and especially national security expertise, someone who, if anything, God forbid, were to happen to him, and happened to him, by the way, sometime between the convention and the election, sometime between the election and the inauguration. I mean, we're in a pandemic and he's in the danger zone. Pick someone who could do the job.
Peter, let's say the election were held today. It looks like Biden would win and win handily. And Donald Trump, you alluded to this in your opening arguments, refuses to concede or throws doubt on the results. And you said keep an eye on the military. I want you to flesh that out a little bit. What are you envisioning?
I mean, look, I think that, hopefully the margin will be so decisive that it makes this harder. But I think we can all very easily imagine a blizzard of tweets talking about all kinds of supposedly, voter fraud that Donald Trump has heard about from some right-wing website or something like that, and suggesting that these things need to be investigated and there needs to be some kind of, looking into this and that kind of thing, right? A kind of a play for time. And then I think the really crucial question will be kind of, what does Mitch McConnell do? What are the talking heads on Fox? What does Sean Hannity say? And hopefully those people will have the decency, which they have not had so far, to say, no, this has gone too far now. You know, you lost, you have to leave. But if they don't, ultimately it could be that we await some kind of press release from the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying that, the United States military respects the will of the American people as expressed and certified by the Election Commission, or something like that, which is basically the equivalent of a gun to the back, and walk out of here. I hope that doesn't happen, but I don't think it's impossible by any.
Peter's twice referred to the American military. I have a chapter on the military and Trump in the new book, so just let me speak to that for a minute. Donald Trump often talks about the military as a pro-Trump institution. He will talk about, I've got the military, I've got the police, I've got bikers for Trump. For sure, he's got bikers for Trump. They're in his corner, and he may well be popular among police. But in every way we can measure that, the military is actually a very un-Trumpy constituency. The Military Times does a survey of military personnel in every December. They did one in 2017, one in 2018, and one in 2019. And Donald Trump has never been popular in the military, and he's been especially unpopular among officers. He has about a 30% approval among military officers. It was very striking in the December of 2017 poll that Secretary Mattis had an approval rating 40 points higher than Donald Trump's. And through these recent demonstrations, the military have been signaling, leave us out of this. I think one of the things that was tremendously telling was the military's attitude toward Donald Trump's proposal for a parade, because that was very obviously a Trump ego trip. And the military just wouldn't do it. They don't refuse an order, of course. They just kept finding reasons. They would say, well, it's going to cost $92 million because we have to budget for the damage that our tanks would do to the streets of DC, and that's a repaving, and there's no repaving line in our budget, so we have to go back to Congress for a new appropriation. Wouldn't it be just simpler just not to do it? And then he would have another idea, and they would have another reason why. Wouldn't it just be simpler if we just skipped it? And they didn't want to be dragooned. I don't think they're going to ever release the press release that Peter described. I think they're just going to, that Donald Trump is going to be turning and say, we're marching on Washington, right? And they're all going to be fishing because they want him to go. And my anecdotal impression is the higher up in the military, if he's got 30% approval among officers generally, but the higher up you go, the lower the approval rating is. I think he's probably reasonably popular he probably doesn't underperform his national average too much among Army colonels, but among 2-star generals, he would be very unpopular. Among 3 stars, hideously unpopular, and among 4 stars, it would be unanimous. One last point about this. If you've spent time reporting on the military, one of the things that you observe is the military is the most racially integrated institution in American life. And it's an institution that is not just racially integrated as a values proposition. Racial integration has become mission critical. This is an institution in which racial minorities are overrepresented. They do life and death work. People have to trust each other. People have to rely on each other. And there's no space. The institution can't function in an atmosphere of racial distrust. And so things like Charlottesville, and things like this, the military sees them as direct attacks on the military's own existence as an institution. Last point on this, and I talk about this in Trumpocalypse. After President Trump's inflammatory remarks after Charlottesville, the first important national figure to make a public statement against what the president had said was not any CEO, it was not any university president, it was the chief of naval operations, the service chief of the Navy. And within 48 hours, every one of the service chiefs had, without criticizing the president or taking a stance, put out a stance saying, we at the Navy, we at the Air Force, we at the Army, we at the Marine Corps, we at the National Guard, we have no place for any kind of racial discrimination or prejudice, and for no one who in any way inflames that. So if Donald Trump is counting on the military to save him, he is in for almost as rude a shock as he gets when the White House butlers politely pack up his things, put them in suitcases, and leave them on the sidewalk on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Okay, that is a perfect ender to a really riveting 1 hour. That went by so quickly. I'll give you both an opportunity for final thoughts. Peter, let's begin with you.
I think that I think David is right that it's going to be a very, very challenging period for Joe Biden if he becomes president. I think the Republican Party will, as they periodically do when they're not out of power, they will rediscover the immense importance of fiscal prudence and the deficit, and they will use that to try to stop the ambitious efforts that Biden wants to push through. But unlike Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, who was able to kind of, whittle away his initially ambitious efforts and basically take whatever half or third of a loaf he could get because that was all that he could get through Congress. Biden will face immense pressure from his left. I mean, it's important to remember that Biden will face a Senate that includes, assuming he doesn't choose her, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, right? Two Democrats in the Senate who are more popular with the Democratic Party base than he is. That's an unusual situation. Biden is not a president like Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, who has a strong visceral connection to the base of his own party. He's more like George H.W. Bush. He's not someone who people are excited or inspired by in his own party. And that means that he doesn't have a lot of margin to disappoint his progressive base. And I think that's why Biden is really going to be trapped between the limitations that the fiscal situation impose on him, and along with the Republicans, and a Democratic Party base that where I disagree a little bit with David is certainly right. There is a segment of Americans, moderate Republicans in particular, who are just desperate for normalcy. But that is not the mood among progressives at all. Their feeling is that this is a moment of desperation about climate, about the economy, and that something dramatic has to be done. And they will have very little patience for Joe Biden if he can't get that done.
Okay, David, final minute or so.
Look, we're heading into a world of trouble, even after the Trump presidency comes to an end. Sluggish economic growth, the job of racial reconciliation, the climate problem, which is going to probably erupt catastrophically, force itself on our notice in the next years. But I'll tell you, and this is very out of character for me, there are very few Ashkenazi optimists. Over 1,000 years, generally, the Ashkenazis who tend to say, this looks like trouble, let's get out of town, tended to have more grandchildren than the Ashkenazis who said, I think it's fine, it'll blow over. So I am genetically selected for pessimism. But despite that temperament, I look at this and I see possibilities. And the possibilities I see are maybe more outside the political system and outside the party system. I think we are going through a moment of moral renewal in American life, like the 1840s. I think we're living through a moment in which, it's been striking. Every day in Washington, or almost every day, I've gone down either in the morning or the evening to watch the protests, safely masked and socially distanced. And I've just noticed with each passing day, they become both bigger and more good-natured. There are more strollers, there are more pets, there are more people with funny signs and fewer people with angry signs. There's more music, there's more dancing. And the attitude, and by the way, the National Guard has become more relaxed and more rediscovering, we're part of the country too. And you are the people who pay us to protect you. I don't want to say anything like it's going to be fine, because I never think that, because once you think it's going to be fine, it's not going to be. But I think in his perverse way, Donald Trump, by showing us the worst in ourselves, has also touched the best in ourselves and given us an opportunity to be better. And so I hope that if we continue this conversation, Peter and I, at some point in the future, that we're going to be able to look back in 2 years or 3 and say, wow, that was tough. Getting all those people back to work, that was tough. Rebuilding the health system, that was tough. And those volcano explosions, they were tough. But but the America that we always believed was there, that we always loved, and that seemed to be taken away from us, that America, it was there. It was there all along. It was just waiting for us.
That is a lovely sentiment, and I'm glad we can end on an up note. So thank you for that. Thank you, both of you, for participating in a fantastic discussion. I learned so much, and not a second was boring. So thank you. And thanks for everyone for participating. If you want to buy David's book, it's on Amazon. We'll plug there. And Yeah, David, Lair, and Janice, thank you for organizing tonight's discussion. Next week, tune in for Mayor Garcetti in conversation with Jim Newton, and that's at 6 o'clock, so that's an hour later than usual. Following week, the deans of UCLA and UC Berkeley Law Schools in conversation with Henry Weinstein on the Constitution in Crisis. I'm Madeleine Brand, and I'll see you sometime in the future, hopefully, maybe face-to-face one day.